What if I told you Halloween was once a queer holiday?
Was it really? Tell me more.
Yes, for decades, queer and trans people used Halloween to step into identities the world otherwise forbid, and to honor the ancestors who made our freedom possible.
You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast produced by me, Max Kuzma, and my good friend Emma Cieslik. We're both lifelong Catholics and members of the LGBTQ community.
We explore Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology, and we're so glad you're here to join us.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma. I'm Max, here with Emma, and today we're closing out our LGBTQ plus history podcast series with a special Halloween episode on honoring our queer and Catholic ancestors.
I couldn't be more excited. Happy Halloween, everyone. There's something about this season, the thinning of the veil, All Souls Day, that makes it feel like the perfect time to remember the queer and trans people who came before us. Their courage, their love, their resistance. They made it possible for us to be here today.
Absolutely. So many of their names have been lost, erased by history or hidden for safety, and yet their lives endure in our liturgies, our communities, and our memories. Today we'll be reflecting on that lineage, from the saints and mystics who defied gender norms to modern queer and trans leaders, activists, and Catholics who paved the way for freedom, inclusion, and joy.
Absolutely. We'll also explore how grassroots historians, oral history projects, and queer Catholic ministries are keeping these stories alive, showing us that remembrance is not just about the past. It's a radical act of connection and care in the present.
So light a candle, whether literally or in your mind, and join us as we honor the ancestors whose lives, resistance, and love continue to shape our queer futures.
Let's get into it.
Well, Emma, I'm super excited to be here with you today to talk about this subject. But I have to say, one of the spookiest things of this season for me has been the fact that my computer died. There was an Apple update, and I used that computer for 5 years, but Apple rolled out an update that actually bricked my computer. So I've been suffering from the ghost of my computer past. And so I have just been having to deal with that a little bit as we've gotten going here, but I'm really excited, especially because the 4 conversations that we have featured as part of this series have been really beautiful and meaningful to me, with Willow, with Jason, Libby, and Marianne, have really meant a lot to me.
Absolutely. I feel the same way. And of course, with it being the Halloween season, it's a time of comings and goings and meetings and partings, especially with beloved computers and programs that give us stability and routine in our lives.
You understand me, and for that, I am very grateful. So I thought to start out this episode, normally we don't really have like an informal chatting part of our podcast because the truth is that I'm a big nerd, and when I listen to a podcast, I'm always like, I want it to start right away. Like, let's get to the meat right away. But this time, I think it would be pretty cool to start with some reflections on Halloween, or past favorite costumes or stories, or even movies that have meant a lot through the season. So I will start with kind of a genderqueer story from 4th grade. So when I was in elementary school, middle school, I was actually always in Catholic schools. And there were a few that I went to because we had moved a few times. And then it was only later, it was in 6th grade. That was the first year that I started being homeschooled, and then I was homeschooled through high school. But so in the time when I was still younger and I was still in Catholic schools, we were dressing up for All Saints' Day. And what I just think is very fascinating is that I wanted to dress as St. Patrick, and they let me. And so I was at that time a little girl, but I had priestly robes. I even had a bishop's mitre and a staff. So I just think that's a really interesting story, and maybe also an example of how like things don't have to be so rigid, you know? Like why not let little girls admire heroic male saints as well, you know? Like there's a little bit of that going on.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And honestly, for me, Halloween has always had somewhat of a sacred meaning and importance, especially as someone raised in a deeply conservative space where Halloween was acceptable, but only on certain terms. So I wasn't really allowed to dress up as as a devil, as a witch, even as a vampire, as anything that was deemed demonic. But at the same time, Halloween was one of the few times where I could imagine myself as someone different. And I think because Halloween was full of many narratives about people that felt they didn't fit in, it really resonated to me. One of my absolute favorites when you mention movies is Halloween Town, classic Disney Channel original movie where Marnie is trying to figure out why she doesn't exist as a normal person in kind of this human world. And it's really because she has this side of her that her parents, or specifically her mom, denies exists. But the whole journey is really kind of a coming out metaphor for Marnie herself, of learning that she has this rich ancestry, this rich identity within Halloween Town, even though it's about her being a witch, that really resonated with me in many ways. So I think Halloween has always occupied a special part in my mind. And just as you say, a lot of my Halloween costumes, as someone who loved history, were deeply, deeply niche. So from Catherine the Great, before the series The Great came out, when I was in high school, including Elizabeth I of England, along with a lot of other niche ones, including being a surgeon one year with getting a full like N95 mask from my dentist office. It was truly, truly a holiday that I could get invested in.
What do you mean you dressed up as Transmedieval Hagiographies, the book, for Halloween?
Completely. I mean, I hate like gay Halloween, but what do you mean? This year specifically, I'm going to be going as one of the three boys that Saint Nicholas resurrected. So truly, so in true spirit, as we get into the Halloween / Christmas Advent season, the story briefly of Saint Nicholas is that three young boys were captured, they were killed, and they were pickled by a butcher. And so basically St. Nicholas is in true like horrifying Catholic history fashion. St. Nicholas was wandering around and he suddenly notices these couple of barrels. And he's like, what's in there? And the butcher's like, I'm not going to tell you. No. What are you, a cop? And so St. Nicholas continues to resurrect these three boys. And in true to form, Shane and Ryan, who host Puppet History, belovedly called them the Pickle Boys, and they got their own song.
Oh
so I'm
my
going
gosh.
as one of the Pickle Boys.
That just makes me think of like, it's always like those posts on social media about how metal Catholicism is, like, or there's like that one famous picture where there's I think it's like a priest and he's driving like a head of somebody. Isn't that right, Emma?
No, it is. It really, really is. Because and I think people forget as well, and this is one thing we talk about, is that there's something inherently Catholic about Halloween. And it's because Halloween itself is related to this syncretism of Catholicism with many local festivals related to this thinning of the veil in many local communities that were subsumed within Catholicism, including Samhain, but as well as other Aztec traditions that gave us the modern Day of the Dead and others across the world. So the whole reason is because Catholicism enveloped them, and Catholicism itself is heavily influenced by a consistent reckoning with death. So memento mori is a huge part of that.
Well said. Yeah, I feel like we could almost do like a whole series, like a whole book almost just about this topic because it's so interesting and rich. I do want to tell one last costume story.
Absolutely.
It's not really like funny, but it is interesting, I think. So, as viewers, listeners may know, I did attend Franciscan University of Steubenville, and that right there is just spooky in and of itself. Like, there's the jump scare. When I was there, I wasn't out as trans. I didn't come out as trans until like 3 or 4 years after college, but I was very gender nonconforming at the time. And so one of my first costumes, and this was this is like so Tumblr era. You have to like understand, like, if you didn't grow up on Tumblr, I don't know if it will like hit for the same way, but I went as a dapper stormtrooper, which means that
Yes.
I purchased from eBay a flimsy stormtrooper like plastic hat, not like the like really nice ones, but just kind of like I had to like stuff it with something to try to get it to like look normal. And then I like just wore like a bow tie and like dapper outfit. And it's funny because then later, I don't know if it was like the next year or like 2 years later, but like then my next costume was the dapper Cheshire cat. And it's just funny in hindsight of like, well, two things. First, it was interesting that that was like tolerated, which that's been a theme that I've talked about before, where like it was tolerated for me to be genderqueer and to wear bow ties and all this stuff as long as I was still a girl. As soon as I transitioned, suddenly everyone has a problem, even though I was obviously displaying an interest in the masculine and a comfort there. And then I think it's, I don't know, I guess it's just also just funny that like I was like, I'm gonna make this point and I'm gonna make it again. I'm gonna make it again. But that's all I've got on the Halloween costume story. So I think the next part, if you're ready, we can roll into when Emma puts on her history hat, which you really does always have on, which I love, and and share with us kind of like some of the background of some of those things you hinted at before.
Absolutely, 100%. And I also want to follow up that for me as well, it was me consistently choosing female world leaders that were canonically like single. So truly funny that all of them were ones that kind of also bucked gender norms throughout history as well. So there are plenty of things about Halloween that really resonate with the LGBTQ plus community, especially the queer Catholic community, as we'll get into a little bit later. The holiday itself really embraces the concept of the outsider or the monstrous, the stranger, in a way that resonates with many in our community that have been pushed to the margins, especially within Catholicism, where queer and trans people often feel that there is an intrinsically disordered part of them, which is reinforced by church doctrine and documents. Halloween is also one of the few holidays where an exploration and intimacy with death, in line with Catholicism's memento mori, is not only tolerated, but it's welcome. It's celebrated as something inherent to the experience. For many queer and trans communities that face immense loss from the HIV and AIDS crisis and continue to face an epidemic of queerphobic violence, campaigns in support of conversion therapy, denials and misinformation about life-saving gender-affirming care, and persistent social stigma and shame that contribute to cultures of loss. Intimacy with death is sadly an everyday reality for many of us. And perhaps as a result, a love or comfort with the macabre is especially important to and popular to many of us. Not to mention goths, subculture's own connection to queerness. So as a result, Halloween has kind of become a sacred holiday, remembering queer and trans ancestors, affectionately called Gay Christmas, with its own niche visual language that we talk about with our costumes. So the concept of Halloween as a genderqueer holiday actually dates back to the early 20th century, when Pittsburgh police announced in 1914 that people would not be arrested for cross-dressing on Halloween and Halloween balls in the 1930s in the South Side of Chicago. Its beloved title actually dates back to the term Bitches Christmas, according to historian Mark Stein, speaking with them, or rather costumed caravans in the 1950s and 1960s Philadelphia. Queer revelers followed drag artists from bar to bar during these celebrations that spawned Halloween parades across the country, including New York City's Village Halloween Parade, founded in Greenwich Village by puppeteer and mask maker Ralph Lee in 1974. But Halloween's queer roots are actually far older. Halloween itself, actually, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, dates back to the Celtic festival of Samhain that marked the end of the harvest season and beginning of winter. In this time, Celts and later many other pagan communities around the world believed that the boundary between the living and the dead was the thinnest. As such, Samhain became a night of ancestor worship among the Celts and others, when the beloved dead came back to visit the living. When the Celts first encountered Catholicism during the Roman occupation in the 4th century, some Celts adopted Christianity. Now, we caution this by saying that this was sometimes under threat of violence or other forms of coercion, but others fought for their own practices like Samhain. Like Catholicism in other areas, including Mexico and Central America, the Catholic colonizers co-opted local customs and folded them into Catholic traditions in an attempt to convert people to the faith. So many small pieces or large pieces of pagan tradition, ritual, and history are woven into what we now identify as Catholicism. The best example, perhaps, that many people recognize is Day of the Dead. So when Aztec festivals honoring the dead merged with Catholic All Saints and All Souls Day. While Halloween's timing overlaps with the Celtic Samhain, its carnivalesque costumes and gender play celebrations are actually indicative of a different Catholic holiday, we would argue. Mardi Gras, Carnival, and Fat Tuesday celebrations in February and March. Like Halloween, Mardi Gras provided a temporary reprieve for queer and trans people from anti-cross-dressing laws, first based in the 19th and 20th centuries, again coinciding with social purity movements. Within Cajun groups, gender inversion was a longtime tradition in Mardi Gras, where men and mixed gender groups would dress up in drag as an old woman with large bosoms and hips created out of skirts and padding. But we caution this by saying that not all people were safe from arrest under these anti-cross-dressing laws. And by the mid-20th century, New Orleans queer community created their own parallel gay carnival to express and celebrate queer identity. It's also important to caveat that Mardi Gras costumes, along with mummering traditions, especially among Irish and Philadelphia-based communities, have a historically complicated controversy attached to them. So while these celebrations like Halloween offered some safety to explore gender, both celebrations are now reckoning with the histories of racist, xenophobic, sexist, and explicitly transphobic dress and behavior. So really, in many ways, there's a rich history connecting not only Halloween to pagan traditions, but also Halloween to connection with ancestors who are no longer with us, ancestors who, as many Celts believed, and some Catholics today, walk among us during these next couple days, or rather these past couple days when this episode comes out. But also the connection of Halloween as an inherently queer Catholic holiday that ties back to our own lived realities of facing systemic violence, but also permissibility and exploration of our identities that for centuries have not been accessible to many of us to live authentically and publicly.
100%. And I think that's so well said. It's, so like my mind immediately goes to the artistic side of things and thinking about like how you can view like the inversion, right? Like there's normal everyday society, and then there's this one night or this one parade or this one carnival where it's like an inversion. So like you have some things that are familiar and recognizable, but some things that are strange and different, or some things that are like maybe like I'm thinking about the controversies as well. Some things that may even like extend those things in a way that, they feel more comfortable to be even more terrible, maybe. I'm not sure. But the idea of the inversion, that visual language or that artistic language, that really strikes me about that part. And then another thing that I really have been thinking about a lot this year with this idea of the harvest season. And honestly, it might just be because now I am a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, the first trans columnist at NCR. And so now I have to be thinking like in a rhythm of like, okay, what am I going to write about next? And as I was thinking about the harvest season, I thought a lot about like basically like the ancient rhythms, the rhythms of life that were guided humans for so long compared to like the modern era. So the contrast between like how for how many years, for how long were these pagan ancient rituals part of the human experience compared to relatively, like it's much relatively shorter, the modern era that we live in. And I guess what really strikes me about that is specifically the idea that there's an ebb and a flow. because I think like one thing about American culture especially is just this go go go. It's like there's never any like we just always expect the numbers to go up, the business chart to keep having that upward arrow. It's like it's just yeah, it's that hustle culture, that grind culture. And so I think there's a lot to learn from this idea of the harvest. A lot of different aspects. Like, for example, the meal. I mean, in Catholicism, there's the Eucharist, so we have that concept inherent to it. And then, of course, like, the meal part is especially relevant right now as we're seeing SNAP benefits not being available to people during an especially as things get colder, as things get tighter. Like it's almost like doubly bad. It's already bad that people don't have access to benefits that help them to access food, but it's like doubly bad in this time. And so that's something that I am really feeling about as a connection to this tradition of around Halloween with Samhain and the harvest. And I kind of just wanted to share that with you, Emma, and see if that strikes a resonance to you as well.
Literally same. And I think more than anything, thinking about this idea of ancestral memory and something that you've said before that I really appreciate is the idea of historical solidarity is more important than ever. So thinking critically about this idea that as we recognize queer and trans ancestors, we're thinking about the people who have fought for our rights and our liberation. But many of the fights that they fought while they were walking on this earth as living people are fights that are still going on. So in thinking about access to food, thinking about access to housing, healthcare, access to childcare, all of these things are precipitously going to be threatened based on what is happening. Many of us here in Washington, D.C. have been feeling the effect of the shutdown for over 3 weeks now. But I think more than anything, people are going to feel the effects of us not yet completing the mission of many of our queer and trans ancestors to make sure that people are fed, to make sure that people are supported throughout their journey, are having access not only to resources that provide continuity and expression, but also provide basic living necessities that many of us don't really often think of if it isn't fresh on our minds or we haven't dealt with the idea of scarcity.
Absolutely. I think the solidarity piece is kind of the whole thing. That's the thing that really resonates with me a lot. And for quite a few reasons. My mind is going in multiple different directions, so I'm going to try to herd all the cats of my thoughts. I don't know if I'm mixing metaphors too much there, but maybe it's a black cat, so then it's Halloween themed. But yes, so I think one of the main parts with solidarity, especially right now, is I know that for many of us in the queer community, it may be that we felt we were the only one because of the particular like religious environment we were in. I know I felt that I was just totally weird and totally strange largely because of the fundamentalist bubble. There was some information in the 90s about LGBTQ identity, but what was out there wasn't getting into my bubble. But I also know for older people, there was nothing. I have a friend, a trans woman that I met when I lived in Alabama, and she's in her late 50s now, and she talked about like going into the dictionary, and at the time the word that she found there was transsexual, and she would just literally all she had was an entry in the dictionary, and I know that there's a really excellent documentary on Netflix called Disclosure, which discusses for trans people the experience of seeing these caricatures where trans people were kind of a joke or were cross-dressing or drag was like a humorous thing in movies and television. And so then having to navigate, how do I know as a real life trans person when to come out? And I've even heard Laverne Cox talk about how she would take the subway and people would just burst out into laughter at her, like she's just trying to live her life. And so kind of navigating through those issues, and basically what I'm building towards, or what I'm discussing here, is how important it is to have history, access to history, to know of the queer people who came before. So when we see efforts today, from the government, but also from other groups that mirror other movements of the past where queer histories have been literally book burnings or things like that, it's so damaging, because that isolation and that loneliness doesn't stop people from having an LGBTQ identity. It's just harmful to them. It's just makes it that much harder, makes it that much lonelier. It impacts the mental health aspect really intensely. And so I think it's interesting that we're kind of combining this discussion of Halloween with this connection to the queer ancestors. And so I kind of wanted to share another angle, another place that my brain went, which is about how technology has changed this a little bit. And so in some of the work that I've done as a documentary filmmaker, I've had the opportunity to document and speak with both people that were alive during the time when the gay bar was the place to go. And that has been a really fascinating experience, because they basically articulate how that was a home when there was no other place. They articulate that, in that time when my friend, all she had was that line in the dictionary, a lot of people only also had the gay bar as a place to not just to learn the histories from the elders who were at the gay bar, but also to learn about how to date, how to present yourself, what are the norms and the expectations within gay culture. That was where you would go to find those things out. I've also had the opportunity to learn more about the MCC, the Metropolitan Community Church, and which is kind of known as I guess the first gay affirming church. And I've had the opportunity to learn about what programs and what things that they were doing during these times of immense change. Because so again, with the 80s and the 90s, it was around the time of when the AIDS crisis was such a big issue. And so you had the queer community showing up for each other. You had lesbians who were taking care of gay men when doctors and nurses who were part of the heterosexual community, the dominant community, were afraid to really, take care of in a meaningful way. So what I mean is not just dressing wounds, but also being there and arranging meals or arranging hospice I being present in that way. And so I'm kind of going all over the place a little bit here, but so just I wrote down these dates so that I could lay it out a little bit. You would be proud of me. I love
it. I'm so excited.
So I wrote down that the MCC was started in 1968, and then we can go into Catholic. So Dignity was 1 year later, started in 1969, and then New Ways Ministry in 1977, and then Outreach is 2022, which is okay, because that was Father Jim didn't get started until he wrote his book in response to the Pulse nightclub shooting, which was in 2016. So, but I kind of just wanted to pull those things together, and I don't know if I did it in the smoothest way, but just to convey that those Catholic ministries were coming out of that time when we didn't have this technology that could connect us as much as we do now. There are many more. First of all, there's more representation that's easily accessible to people, young queer Catholic people now. You can go on social media and you can follow people who are visibly out representative. And you can connect through Discord servers, through Facebook groups, through private and public options, and you can, read materials on Substack that are from queer Catholic people. But yeah, just to say that there were queer Catholic organizations that were mobilizing, and queer Christian. I think the role of the MCC can also should not be understated. They also had a hugely important role. So just kind of a grab bag of things there, Emma.
No, I love that. And I think it's so incredibly important because it also ties to the idea that not only were um, queer organizers, queer and trans organizers, pivotal in this shift as we see during the 1980s. And just as you say, not only to feed and clothe the sick and the dying, but also to bury the dead. One of the big things out of this period that coincides with Halloween and when we connect with our ancestors is that many queer people, many trans people, many gay people during the HIV and AIDS crisis were denied palliative and funeral care because people were worried about contracting HIV and AIDS. So some of the most influential people were the people that stepped up and organized blood drives, especially lesbian individuals at this time, but also the people that provided closure and sacred endings for communities that were losing so many of their members at the time. And especially just as you say, that some provided community and sacred endings for people whose families didn't even want to be with them at the very end. So more than anything, I think that's critical, but it also ties to how queer Catholics were key in this organizational space, even back before Stonewall. So one of the things that I think is incredibly important, and definitely if you're interested in the history of dignity, listen to our episode with Marianne or with Jason, because some of the earliest organizations, not only that happened around faith, but just around queer organizing, were Catholic ones. They were ones of people that were grappling with this effect and what it meant to find community and solidarity with others. And it ties not only back to present, and present being, as a historian, present being modern-esque, so 1950s to today, but also to historical examples. So as we've talked about and what we're eager to discuss with Blake, that as well as
Blake and Alicia.
Blake and Alicia. I don't know, for some reason I thought of Allison. And I was like, that's wrong. Is how there is a deep, rich history of queer and trans representation within the church. And it largely ties to where, Max, you and I started, is that in this whole time, the idea and the claim, a true one, that gender diversity has always been in the history of the church, has always been part of our queer Catholic communities, is a deeply controversial one. But what these communities affirm with their work with Dignity, New Ways Ministry, and others is that we are not a modern phenomenon. And it's something other queer and trans activists argue, that throughout the history of humans and throughout the history of the Catholic Church, there are a number of queer and trans people that have existed, whether or not they claimed or understood or identified with those terms.
100%. I think that's so well said. And I think I'm just wanting to jump in to say as well, like, you know, for young people, I think it's so often like, well, where can I fit in now? Or like, who will accept me now? Which is very important. Like, don't get me wrong, that is important. But I think that what I'm wanting to convey maybe to younger people, which is weird to say because I still feel like I'm very young, but I think what I'm wanting to convey is that, like, our story has always been there, and it's out there still for us to connect to and to find meaning and draw strength from. And in many ways, I really do think it is the stories of our queer ancestors is how we get through the hard things that we have to face now. And so I guess I'm just wanting to really underscore that as a source of hope. And honestly, also, like, for people who aren't as interested in history, it doesn't mean you have to like memorize those dates or know everything. I don't have them memorized. I had them written on a sticky note. But like, for real though, like this is like your lineage. This is something that you can draw from. And also, like, when you learn and know and understand these things, it also really helps you to connect with the older generation of queer people. I kind of alluded to, you know, the bar culture used to be a place where the younger generation could connect to the elders. And that is something that gets kind of lost in the online discourse, especially when I was like younger. A lot of the online discourse was the feeling that older people had that the development of terminology was leaving them behind. And I really feel that this history is a really good way to kind of bridge the gap, because in learning someone's history, in sharing histories, in telling your story, whether you are the young person telling your story or the older person telling your story, you're making those connections and bridging those gaps that we might not always have the perfect language for, like as a generational difference, but that in telling the stories, we can see ourselves in those people. And so, I mean, and that's really, I think that's a Christian virtue in and of itself, is that ability to see the humanity in another person, to connect with their story. So I just think that part is really important too.
I completely agree. And you said that so well. It's thinking about this idea that connecting with history doesn't have to be an academic or purely, I think, like elitist practice. And that is fair, because I think some people, when they approach history, think of it solely through the lens of academia, which can be really classist and racist and queerphobic in the ways that it understands and shares and celebrates history. But in many ways, connecting and celebrating and honoring our queer and trans ancestors, especially this Halloween, can look like finding and recognizing someone who went through a similar struggle that you did. It's about finding someone who can understand and who you can talk to. In the same way that within the Catholic tradition, many people reach out to and connect with saints, specifically saints that went through a similar experience to our own, whether that be mental health struggles, whether that be family abuse, whether that be troubled relationships. The ways in which we connect with saints is very much the ways in which we can connect with queer and trans ancestors, people who have lived through histories and struggles of stigma, grief, and loss in the same ways that we have. And those can be connecting with ancestors whose names we know. Thinking about Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Harvey Milk, but it can also be connecting with ancestors whose names we don't know. So for many of us, we may have queer and trans ancestors in our own families. Were they able to live out publicly as their true selves during their lifetimes? No. It was the reality of many people. Largely, a good number of people weren't able to live authentically as themselves out of threat of violence, being disowned by their family, intense loss of their community, of their loved ones. It's a culture of violence and violence and isolation that persists to this day. But even if we don't have their specific names, there is great power and importance politically and spiritually in standing in communion with queer and trans ancestors who have fought the good fight before us.
And I also think there's also the power in like the saints of myth or the saints of legend. I mean, like, when I was growing up, I loved the story of George and the Dragon. I'm not sure how, like, literal that one is. Will you share with us, Emma, of some of those mythic genderqueer saints?
Absolutely. I'd love to. So there's such a huge collection of queer and trans saints. So this is thinking about, so specifically in the medieval period, and there's actually a really interesting exhibition going on right now at the Met Cloisters called Spectrum of Desire, that's all focused on discourse surrounding sexuality and gender during the medieval period. So specifically, what this exhibition and what I want to talk about is centered on the idea that many theologians at the time, many saints, considered God, as we do today, above and separate from human constructs. And so the way in which people would resemble or come to occupy the divine was in transcending human constructs and binaries like gender. So as a result, many hagiographers that were documenting the lives of saints would document them as pointedly genderqueer and kind of blurring these boundaries of what gender presentation and expression looked like. So some of my favorite examples tie actually to the histories of these saints. So not hagiographers that were looking and reflecting on their stories, but actually lives of the saints whose own engagement and conversations with God point to a divinity of queerness itself. So Saint Marino specifically being a saint that was assigned female at birth, but then entered a convent wearing men's clothes and living as a man with his father, is an especially important one, along with Saint Wilgefortis, who is my absolute favorite. So Saint Wilgefortis was a young woman who was betrothed by her father to a pagan king. And she refused to marry him. She said, I'm not going to do it. I have made, in the tradition of virgin martyrs, this kind of mystical relationship with Christ and devoted my virginity to him. Much to discuss related to purity culture and how that fits into virgin martyrs. There's a wonderful article in US Catholic deconstructing it. But specifically, she said, I'm not going to do it. And so she prayed to God. Prayed to God to help her escape this marriage. And what God granted her was growing a beard. And in a most beautiful way. And so her husband immediately said, wedding's off. I'm not doing this. And her father basically said, how dare you? I'm going to crucify you. So basically, there is a portrait in an illuminated manuscript of Saint Wilgefortis in the Spectrum of Desire exhibit, which is so cool. But for a large period of time, people didn't identify Saint Wilgefortis because so many depictions of Jesus on the cross had feminine style figures and attributes. So they just assumed that this was Jesus. But in actuality, this was a really deep and rich history of how this queerness that she came to embody, and that resonates with many people with PCOS like myself, is incredibly meaningful and associated with God as a blessing, rather than this being something that was a detraction from who she was. It was a gift that allowed her to live her life authentically and truly as she was. So those are two of my favorites. There are so many more, but I also advise people to look into specifically not just illustrated art, but also musical art of Hildegard of Bingen, but people to also investigate just discourse around art of Jesus. So specifically, there's a lot investigating how the side wound was often untethered from Jesus, and often took on the appearance and also the spiritual and collective iconography of a vulva. That's really, really interesting. So there's a lot of gender bending history, not only in art, but also inherent to our discourse around some of the most critical people in the Catholic and Christian faith. So there are many queer and trans ancestors.
No, I think that's perfectly well said, Emma. I love listening to you talk about it because you have such a deep understanding and you can articulate it and tie it in so well. I really love that. And I just wanted to say as well, I think one of my favorite things about those histories and those ways of thinking and looking and participating in those conversations is it really challenges this idea of the construct of traditional family values or like traditional values, whatever that is. Because it's like, well, if in the medieval period they were drawing Jesus this way, or if they had these stories of Saint Williforgus or things like that, like then there really never was this mythical, magical time when straight heterosexuality was like just literally like, it's not like it was on the tablets that God gave to Moses. Like there's always been a mixture of people. There's always been a mixture of identities, whether or not, you know, that's the other element is we haven't always had the language that we have today to describe them the way that we do, but human beings have always existed within diversity and have represented and manifest that through art, through the contributions of queer artists that we always talk about, the queer artists in the choir, Michelangelo, the queer artists of the Renaissance. And so I just really think that is one of the most interesting things too, is to just say, oh yeah, history's on my side of traditional family values. Well, I'm not sure if that's quite exactly true.
I had a wonderful conversation with the creator, Tyler Gunther, behind The Greedy Peasant. I don't know if you're familiar. So The Greedy Peasant is a content creator on TikTok and Instagram. He specifically creates content around what it means to, yes, to embody queerness within medieval time periods. So whether that means through dressing as kind of this genderqueer medieval peasant, but also imagining and identifying queerness within kind of the Catholic lexicon of the medieval period, especially as talking reliquaries and tassels. A lot of the Greedy Peasants content highlights just this, how there's often a construct within our popular culture that the medieval period was a time of increasingly traditional gender roles. And albeit there was increased persecution of LGBTQ plus people and people that defied what a traditional gender binary would be, but the binary was not the same one that we have today. And the enforcement of this was much different. So the ways in which people dressed, the ways in which people engaged with one another was strikingly different. It reminds me of, in this Spectrum of Desire exhibition, one of my favorite things there was this woven linen tapestry of the conversation between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And so basically in the conversation, the Queen of Sheba poses a question to King Solomon and says, so Solomon, how would you, and these are two interconnected riddles, tell the difference between a boy and a girl dressed exactly the same and a real and artificial flower? And basically King Solomon said, well, I would tell based on action. So specifically for the flowers, I would send out a bee and the bee would always go to the real flower. But problematic as it is, Solomon said, well, a girl is always going to be someone who kneels down when she picks apples, which feels so obscure and weird. But it was how in the medieval period, a lot of constructs of gender were not specifically through presentation, but often through action and what expectations were surrounding different gender roles of the time period. So constructing kind of, as we've talked about, this Crusader Bros idea of like this super gruff, super masculine idea of what a Crusader looks like was deeply wrong for what the reality was for many medieval peasants and kings and queens of this time period. So people that are trying to LARP medieval men and women of this time period really deny the fact that gender diversity was not only part of the history of the Catholic Church, but also our collective history and our medieval history, and the very history they're trying to use to justify their bigotry.
Very well said. Yeah, I think that's the thing about history, is that you can never claim it just for yourself. It's always going to have, all of the characters are always going to be shifting. There's always the ebb and flow. Like, it's never just one way. It's never just like, oh yeah, all of history like supports just me and just my views. There's just, it's always going to be diverse and dynamic, and I think that's the other thing that I really think is valuable from engaging with history, is practicing again this ability of looking at things more complexly, instead of just, oh, it's just this one way and that's just how it is. So as we draw our conversation to a close here, Emma, I was trying to think of a good question to ask you, but you kind of like implicitly answered most of the ones that I had. But maybe I will ask you the hope question. I know that one is always a little hard, but as you delve deep into all of these histories, and as you live through some very challenging times as someone living near Washington, D.C., what gives you hope, or where do you draw hope from all these experiences?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question. And for me, it ties into exactly what we're talking about today. I find hope not only in histories, so in acknowledging that our communities have been through intense bigotry, intense violence, intense loss, and sustained themselves and come together during times of chaos and found solidarity and mutual aid. But also the fact that I do not stand alone in my project of queer liberation. I think more than anything, it's the idea that this Halloween, as I'm remembering queer and trans ancestors, as the Celts would believe they walk among us, I am not the only person who is fighting this battle. And I'm not the first person, nor will I be the last, to fight the campaign of queer liberation and queer civil rights. But all of the people who have come before me create and sustain the work that I do. They have created and pushed it so much further so that I'm able to live authentically as who I am, and so that we're able to have conversations that we do today. Even though that we're living in an extremely dark time, I find comfort and hope in the fact that as long as I can continue to tell queer histories, as long as I can continue to tell the histories of my own people, I and my identity and the fight that I fight every single day will continue to live on. So I'm hopeful every single day that in connecting with the many ancestors who have come before me, I not only find strength, but also find and am emboldened by many people who have gone before me and laid down their lives, just like the saints of the Catholic Church for the cause of queer rights. But many of the people that have just through the action of trying to exist authentically as themselves at times when this wasn't possible, are excited and eager for me to continue the project of living authentically as who I am every single day. So it's one of those moments where Halloween, tying back to what I said in the beginning about Marnie and Halloween Town as kind of this fictive coming out story, Halloween has always been a reminder that not only do I stand on the shoulders of members of the queer community, but I'm part of an immense legacy of people that have been pushing for liberation and justice for not only decades, but for centuries. And my existence as a queer Catholic person, as a queer person, is inherently tied to a long legacy, a long lineage of people who have fought for me to stand where I do today.
I think that's beautifully said. And I think that is the same type of meaning that people are looking for in religion, in society, in any group that you belong to, in, you know, even just your regular ancestry. Like what I am part Polish. I think you are Polish as well. And like what did Polish people go through, that what lessons did they go through that they in some way have handed to me, even though I don't know all of their stories intimately? Like I think that is very powerful, and I think that was really beautifully said. And so before we like officially end here, Emma, do you have any final word you'd like to leave everyone with?
You read my mind. I think the one thing I want to emphasize is that remembering and celebrating queer and trans ancestors doesn't inherently have to be spiritual. I think there's an expectation with Halloween, with Samhain, that connecting with and recognizing the idea that ancestors live and exist among us is going to be an inherently religious thing. But I don't think so. I think the ways in which we engage with history, going to a museum, listening to a podcast with a content creator discussing history, learning from and listening to an oral history by a member of the community is itself a practice of continuing to keep the legacies of our ancestors alive. And whether or not that is an inherently Catholic experience, an inherently religious experience, I do believe it is an inherently sacred and political one. So my emphasis is that wherever anyone is in terms of their religious background, their religious practice, know that connecting with and privileging and prioritizing the names and the histories of our trans and queer ancestors is not something that you have to do the best way you know how. It's not a way that you have to excel at or know exactly how you're going to practice. It can start, just as we said at the beginning, with lighting a candle for queer and trans ancestors, lighting a candle that has Marcia or Sylvia's face on it. It can be saying the name of ancestors within your family that you suspect might have been queer. It can be connecting with and providing mutual aid and support for your communities and knowing the legacies of those before you that have done this work. So connecting with and honoring your queer and trans ancestors is not something that only comes on Halloween. It's a practice that has to be continued on throughout the year, and a practice that we can do in every single way that is meaningful to us. Thank you for joining us as we honored our queer and trans ancestors this Halloween and recognize Halloween as a true queer Catholic holiday. Their lives, courage, and love remind us that our freedom and joy are built on the work of those who came before.
And remembering isn't just about the past. It's an invitation to carry their legacy forward, to live boldly, care deeply, and keep building communities of love and resistance.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Substack, and YouTube. We'd love to hear your thoughts, memories, or stories of ancestors who inspire you. Reach out and share them with us.
Down the line, we'll continue exploring queer Catholic histories with medieval saints and trans and genderqueer figures in early hagiography. So stay tuned for more stories that illuminate the past and imagine a more inclusive future.
Until then, keep the joy, courage, and love alive. Goodbye, everyone!